Welcome to The Appleseed, the storytelling podcast from BYU Radio, where your family can gather for great stories from great storytellers in every episode. Stories bring us together, and we hope the stories on the show will spark memories and thoughts that you can share with the people you love. On today's show, we've got a story and some songs that are each in their own way about how people express faith, and even about how people express faith in different ways than you express faith. Our first story is from North Carolina storyteller Donald Davis, and it's about a neighbor who doesn't go to church, or does he? Here's the story. It's called Jack Marr Builds a House, and we're happy to bring it to you on the Appleseed.
When I was growing up, we lived not in town, but out on the edge of town. You see, my dad worked at the bank and my mother taught school, but they had both grown up on farms through the Depression. So we had to live far enough out in the country that we could have a big garden, we could have chickens, we could have a milk cow, so if the Depression came back, we were not going to starve. We were going to be able to eat. We lived on about 10 acres of land. The land was between Plot Creek and Plot Creek Road. And as our land came down, the road and the creek got closer and closer and closer together, so it turned into a little triangle at the end. And that little triangle was fenced off because it didn't really fit in the cow pasture part. And my daddy thought that little triangle was not worth anything. Until one day there was a knock on the door. And a man named Jack Marr was at our door, and he asked my daddy if he could buy that little triangle of land because he was getting married and he wanted to build a house. And that's when my daddy discovered that land was not worth nothing. It was worth something. And he sold that land to Jack Marr. And that was the beginning of one of the most educational time periods in my life. Because you see, Jack Marr built his own house. And without his even asking, I helped. So he worked at Dayton Rubber Company where they made fan belts. And he worked the 7 to 3 o'clock shift. So he got off from work about the same time I got out of school. And he would get over there to work, and I would get home, and I would walk from the house right across through our pasture over to where he was working. My vocabulary improved helping him build that house. No, I learned terms like, batter boards and soffits, in addition to some of those little short words that he used sometimes when things wouldn't fit together just right. Now, there's only one problem with Jack Marr building his own house. He worked on the house on Sunday. And we would get up on Sunday morning and we would get ready to go to church. We went in town to the Methodist church and we would get all ready and we'd get in the car and my daddy would back out the driveway, and as we would start down the road, my mother's eyes would search for Jack Marr. And there she would see him working on Sunday. And her eyes would be glued to him all the way down the road. And she would say, he doesn't go to church, like it was my daddy's fault for selling the land to him. Well, we got back home and we pulled in the driveway. And while my mom was finishing our Sunday dinner, I headed straight across the pasture so I could tell Jack Marr what my mother said about it. Because I'd learned when my mother said things about people, if I would tell those people, I would hear something about my mother. So I went over there and I said, Jack, because that's what he had told me to call him. I said, Jack, my mama says you don't go to church. And he just laughed. He said, your mama. He said, I do go to church, but right now I'm in a bind. And even if it's Sunday, I have to get this house enclosed before wintertime comes. And then he said, sit down here just a minute, let's talk. He said, son, did you know that church is not just a place you go. He said church is what happens on the spot when every time you meet somebody, they have a better day because they met you than they could have had any other way. I went back and told my mama that. She was not impressed. Well, the house kept growing, and the house kept growing, it kept growing. Things kept coming along. And every Sunday we'd go down that road and look again. And he got to the point where they'd gotten married, and he got to the point at which the inside, was closed in, and they could go ahead and move into the house, before wintertime, while he finished everything on the outside. Ever move in a house like that, while it gets finished? So they got moved into the house, and they invited us on that first Saturday night to come over to their house for supper. And we went over to our house. We had to walk on little planks across the yard because, the yard would be the very last thing that was ever done. And we got in the house, and we had supper, and then we went in the living room, and we sat down and watched the first television set we had ever seen that was turned on. My brother and I had actually watched television in Massey Furniture Company when we went to town. But back then, they didn't have, in the furniture store, they didn't have the TV sets turned on because nobody wanted to buy a television that had part of the programs used up on it. But we went in that living room, and my daddy said, "Stay way back, boys, stay way back. You get close and put your eyes out. Don't get close to it, don't get close to it." And that television came on, and we watched from Renfro Valley, Kentucky, Red Foley singing the Salty Dog Rag. And when that program was over, we watched something called Lawrence Welk with a machine making bubbles and accordions playing and dancing happening. Oh, it was like magic. It was snowing on that television too. Just all the time, even indoors. It was snowing. Well, we went back home that night, and the next day we headed out to church. By now, Jack was starting to paint the outside of the house. And as we started down the road and my mother focused on him, he had a big A-frame ladder, a ladder bigger. I'd never seen a ladder that big. It was A-frame. It came up like this, and then the middle part went on up higher, and he was way up on that ladder painting around under the eaves of the house. And I thought, wow, that's a huge ladder. My daddy would never let me climb on a ladder that big. That's amazing that he's up on that big ladder painting. And we got back home from church, and my mother was finishing up our Sunday dinner. Of course, I headed over there to see what was going on. And by now, the ladder had moved around to the end of the house. And as I went across through our pasture, he was up there painting around the eaves and soffits. And as I got closer, the window at the house right where he was painting, the window was open, and the most beautiful music I had ever heard was coming out of that window, and he was painting to the music. It was like watching a symphony conductor. To that beautiful music, he would dip the brush in the paint, and he would paint back and forth. Sometimes he would just sing along with it, painting back and forth. It was just beautiful to watch. Well, his wife, Ada, brought me in the door, and I said, "That's the most beautiful music I've ever heard." She said, "Oh, it's on the television we'd watched the night before." And we came around into the living room, and there on that television, playing and singing, with Jack on the ladder outside the window, perfect with the time change from Utah to North Carolina, the Mormon Tabernacle Choir. And I stood there and I watched him on the ladder painting, and I watched them sing and watched that beautiful music, and it was just gorgeous to behold. And it came to the end, and the announcer came on and said, "This program has been brought to you by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints." And that's when I knew what Jack Moore was. He had to be a Latter-day Saint. You know, many years have passed since then. By the time I finished high school, I had a little string of Methodist perfect attendance Sunday school pins that would reach all the way down past my belt. And I can tell you almost nothing I remember from Sunday school. But I will never forget what the world's one and only Latter-day Saint told me on that early day. Church is not just a place you go. It's what happens on the spot. When everybody who meets you has a better day because they met you than they could have had any other way.
Donald Davis with his story, Jack Marr Builds a House. And listening to this story reminds me actually of my family on my mom's side. There's a lot of religious diversity on that side of the family. A lot of people who express faith in ways that are unlike the ways that other people in that family express faith. Where their lives overlapped mine, my grandparents found church homes among the Baptists, then the Lutherans, then the Episcopalians in their California town. My Aunt Ann and Uncle Rob have worked in the ministry in all kinds of Christian churches. My Aunt Christine has spent her adult life as a church organist, and my Uncle Peter just retired after a long career in the ministry. Me, I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And you know how people say to never discuss politics or religion if you want to avoid conflict? Well, with so much religious diversity on that side of the family, among people for whom faith is primary among the ways that they identify themselves, I've wondered sometimes how we all get along so well, but we do. But then I remember a few things. I remember, for example, that while there are a lot of ways in which we're different, we're all musicians, and we have a long-standing tradition of singing a blessing together on the food at mealtimes. Sometimes we sing, "Heavenly Father, kind and good, now we thank Thee for our food, for Thy love and tender care, for the blessings that we share. Lord of all, to Thee we raise this our hymn of grateful praise." Or we sing, "Be present at our table, Lord, be here and everywhere adored. These mercies bless and grant that we may strengthened for Thy service be." And in those moments, it's not so much about the theology as it is about the harmony. And after remembering those musical blessings, I remember the food. That's a family of pretty good cooks, and that helps too. And that's where Donald's story took me. Where did the story take you? And who will you take along? Hi, Sam here, and I want to take just a moment to let you know about a new podcast from BYU Radio. It's called Uncomfy, Sticking with Moments That Challenge Us. And it's a podcast in which you hear stories from people who experienced something, either tough advice from a close friend or engagement with somebody on the other end of the political spectrum, conversations that made them really uncomfortable. But instead of backing away or getting angry or defensive, they kind of leaned in. They sort of stuck with the discomfort and heard out the person that was communicating with them. And they're glad they did. Not because it changed their position, because it clarified their own beliefs. And Uncomfy, the podcast, features stories of folks who engaged in that way. It's really helping me engage with a world in which division really seems to be the norm. Uncomfy, Sticking with Moments That Challenge Us is the name of the podcast. And, if you listen to the Appleseed, then you've heard us say stories bring us together. That's kind of how I feel about the conversations that happen on Uncomfy. You can find it wherever you might be listening. You can watch it on the BYU Radio app. It's a video and audio podcast. There are lots of great ways to engage with these conversations. Uncomfy, Sticking with Moments That Challenge Us. Check it out. Thanks for spending some time with us on the Appleseed today. Next up, we've got a song from the great Appalachian storyteller and musician Josh Goforth. Now, by way of introduction, there's a reverent old bluegrass hymn tune called Don't You Hear Jerusalem Mourn, with lyrics like, "Oh, I got a home on the other shore. Don't you hear Jerusalem moan? I know I'll live there forevermore. Don't you hear Jerusalem moan?" Well, you'd hear it sung that way in church, but sometimes the after-church crowd gets a hold of a song like that and makes up their own version that may be a little less reverent, but maybe useful in its own way. This one is a pretty good-humored look at hypocrisy. And while church preachers are the butt of the joke in this tongue-in-cheek song, it would do all of us to take a look at whether we're walking the walk we talk when it comes to faith. There's more to say about the tune, but we'll let Josh say it. Here's Josh Goforth on the Appleseed.
If you grow up in the Baptist church, there is 2 sermons that are preached every Sunday. One of the 2 sermons, one of them is, of course, you better get right with God. That's the first sermon, and we kind of know what that's about. And the other sermon is about what my great aunt called hypocrites. Now, that's somebody who's been backsliding. Either they've not been to church in a long time and somehow they make it back. Or maybe they've done something everybody knows they done, but they don't want to admit it. Or maybe they've been caught gambling in some back room or something. Then they have the nerve to come down to church like they ain't been a gambling. So that's the second sermon. And, in church we sing all kinds of different songs. And a lot of them are based around the sermons that the preacher preaches. And so I'd like to sing you one of these songs about hypocrites, as we'd say in the mountains. And I learned this song from Inez Chandler, one of the ballad singers from over in Madison County. And it's one of the funny gospel songs, I guess you could say, but it does have a message about these hypocrites and how they better get right. And it pretty much hits every religion, although I haven't written a Mormon verse yet, but I need to. And I might do that at some point. You may hear me somewhere down the road, but here it is. This is called Don't You Hear Jerusalem Mourn? And we're going to sing it in the old style without accompaniment. Here's how it goes. There's a Baptist preacher, and I'll tell you, don't you hear Jerusalem mourn? He's got a bottle in his pocket that he can't hardly tote. Don't you hear Jerusalem mourn? Don't you hear Jerusalem mourn? Don't you hear Jerusalem mourn? Thank God there's a heaven that's a-ringing in my soul, and my soul set free. You hear Jerusalem mourn. Now there's a Methodist preacher, and I'll tell you, don't you hear Jerusalem mourn? He'd never let a rooster get old enough to crow. Don't you hear? That's gluttony, by the way. Don't you hear Jerusalem mourn? Don't you hear Jerusalem mourn? Don't you hear Jerusalem mourn? Thank God there's a heaven that's a-ringing in my soul, and my soul set free. Don't you hear Jerusalem mourn? Well, them Presbyterians are so proud. Don't you hear Jerusalem mourn? They got a neck so stiff that they can't hardly bow. Don't you hear Jerusalem mourn? Don't you hear Jerusalem mourn? Don't you hear Jerusalem mourn? Thank God there's a heaven that's a-ringing in my soul, and my soul set free. Don't you hear Jerusalem mourn? Now that Catholic priest, he's a ringing his bell. Don't you hear Jerusalem mourn? If you pay him $5, he'll pray you out of purgatory. Don't you hear Jerusalem mourn? Don't you hear Jerusalem mourn? Don't you hear Jerusalem mourn? Thank God there's a heaven that's a ringing in my soul, and my soul set free. Don't you hear Jerusalem mourn? Now there's a Baptist ma'am, she's a settin' in the pew. Don't you hear Jerusalem mourn? Oh, God's judging her, but she's a judging you. Don't you hear Jerusalem mourn? Don't you hear Jerusalem mourn? Don't you hear Jerusalem mourn? Thank God there's a heaven that's a ringing in my soul, and my soul set free. Don't you hear Jerusalem mourn? Now here's a modern verse. Them TV preachers, you can hear 'em pray. Don't you hear Jerusalem mourn? Oh, they're raking in the money while they're rolling in the hay. Don't you hear Jerusalem mourn? Don't you hear Jerusalem mourn? Don't you hear Jerusalem mourn? Thank God there's a heaven that's a ringing in my soul, and my soul set free. Don't you hear Jerusalem mourn? Oh, don't you love it?
Josh Goforth with Don't You Hear Jerusalem Mourn, a parody of an old bluegrass hymn tune. And again, while it points a comical finger at preachers, it could just as well point to any of us when we're believing in one direction and living in another. We're going to end today with one more song, one more reflection on faith. The song was written in 1901, and it wonders what so many wonder about people who may have suffered in one way or another during their lives and are now passed on. What are they doing in heaven today is the question, and it's also the title of the song. Singing it for you is Robert B. Jones, the wonderful storyteller, musician, and preacher. Here's Reverend Jones and his custom ukulele here on the Appleseed.
Today, friends and sorrow are all gone away. Ooh, peace abound like a river, they say. What are they doing there now? Chorus is easy. What are they doing in heaven today, where sins and sorrow are all done away? Ooh, peace abound like a river, they say. What are they doing there now? I'm thinking of those whom I used to know, who lived and suffered in this world below. They've gone up to heaven, but I want to know, what are they doing there now? And there are those whose lives were burdened with care. They fought through their trials with sighing and tears, clung to the cross with a trembling fear. But what are they doing there now? Well, what are they doing in heaven today? Sins and sorrow are all done away. Ooh, peace abound like a river, they say. What are they doing there now? There are those whose bodies were full of disease. Physicians and doctors couldn't give them much ease. They suffered till death brought a final relief. But what are they doing there now? There are those who are poor and often despised, who looked up to heaven with tear-blinded eyes, while others were heedless and deaf to their cries. But what are they doing there now? Well, what are they doing in heaven today? Sins and sorrow are all done away. Oh, peace abound like a river, they say. What are they doing there now? Well, peace abound like a river, they say. What are they doing there now?
Robert B. Jones with What Are They Doing in Heaven Today? What are some of the ways you express the beliefs that you hold most dear? If you're a person of faith, how has your faith matured as you've grown older? How do you show respect for people of other beliefs while honoring your own? We want to thank Donald Davis, Josh Goforth, and Robert B. Jones for bringing us their memories and songs and stories today. You've listened to them. Now it's time to share some stories of your own. The Appleseed is produced by me, Sam Payne, Wendy Folsom, Brian Tanner, and Kira Van Dam. Our audio engineer is DJ Cromarty, and the rest of the Appleseed team is Tristan Schetzel, Kay Hendricks, and Nico Wetzel. And if you like today's podcast, subscribe, rate us, leave us a review, and tell your friends. That's how the podcast grows. We also love to receive emails. Email us at theappleseed@byu.edu. That's theappleseed, all one word, at byu.edu. Your thoughts and comments help us shape the future of the Appleseed. We're pleased and proud to be among the many podcasts produced by the BYU Radio family of shows. If you want more great storytelling for the whole family, then search for our companion podcast, Kaboom, where you'll hear original audio adventures for the whole family. You can find any episode of The Appleseed or Kaboom on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, on the BYU Radio app, or at byuradio.org. I'm Sam Payne, and we can't wait to be with you again on The Appleseed.